The ballroom lights shimmered like diamonds across the crystal chandeliers, but no sparkle could match the eyes of the guests who gathered to witness what they believed would be another effortless victory for the Lancaster dynasty. The heiress, Victoria Lancaster, daughter of one of the most powerful white banking families in New York, stood near the towering cake. 5 tiers of sculpted perfection draped in ivory frosting and edible pearls. She didn't just stand there to celebrate. She stood to claim her dominance in a room full of sharks. And one particular shark she was ready to humiliate. Across the polished marble floor, Marcus Kane entered, every step precise, every glance commanding. A black CEO who had built his empire from nothing, he was about to close a historic $4 billion deal that would expand his influence into global tech and finance. To many, he was an outsider. To Victoria, he was an intruder. She watched him approach with his calm, unshakable confidence, and the sight ignited something cruel in her chest. The orchestra softened. Guests turned. The air grew tighter as Marcus greeted the investors, his voice steady, his handshake firm. And just as the deal's announcement was moments away, Victoria made her move. She lifted her champagne glass, smiled sweetly, and then, in front of everyone, slammed a thick slice of cake into Marcus's suit. Gasps cut through the room like knives. Cream smeared across his tailored jacket, crumbs clung to his tie, and the silence after was deafening. Then came the laughter. Not from Marcus, but from Victoria and her friends, their shrill giggles echoing across the hall. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said mockingly. "I didn't see you there. Maybe it's just easier to mistake you when you're not used to being in places like this." Every camera in the room caught it. Every whisper carried the sting of humiliation. Marcus froze, his jaw tightening, but his eyes burned with something no one could yet read. People leaned closer, waiting for his reaction, waiting for him to break, to lash out, to crumble under the weight of her insult. But he didn't. Instead, he calmly picked up a napkin, dabbed at his jacket, and smiled. That smile unsettled Victoria. It wasn't the smile of a man defeated. It was the smile of a man calculating. And as she tilted her chin higher, as if she had secured her victory, Marcus leaned closer and whispered words that only she could hear. Words that drained the color from her face in an instant. What did he say? The guests couldn't know, not yet. They only saw Victoria's confidence flicker, just for a second. And then Marcus stepped back, his voice steady as he addressed the crowd. Sometimes, the sweetest cake hides the bitterest poison. The room shifted. Laughter died. Unease spread. Investors exchanged glances, sensing something had changed, though they couldn't put their finger on it. Victoria forced another laugh, trying to regain control, but for the first time in her life, her laughter felt hollow. Marcus excused himself with elegance, walked away as if nothing had happened, and the deal papers remained on the table, untouched. And here's where everything spiraled. Within minutes, just as Victoria began to bask again in what she thought was triumph, word spread through the room that Marcus had given an order. Something about freezing assets. Something about contracts withdrawn. A $4 billion deal teetered on collapse, and Victoria Lancaster was at the center of it. The heiress turned pale. She clutched her glass tighter, whispering to her father, but he looked shaken. Because whatever Marcus had whispered in her ear, it wasn't just a threat. It was a promise. And this is where I want you to stop and ask yourself. If you were Marcus, humiliated in front of the world, would you have walked away quietly? Or would you have done what he did next? Comment your answer right now, because the choice he made in the next 10 minutes stunned everyone in that room and changed the balance of power forever. Because Marcus wasn't just humiliated. He was about to humiliate her, and the way he did it made even her own allies turn against her. But how? That's the secret Victoria never saw coming. If you were in Marcus's place, would you fight humiliation with revenge, or walk away with dignity? Comment below, because the next twist proves that one whispered sentence can destroy an empire. The ballroom buzzed like a disturbed hive. Victoria tried to shrug it off, her lips stretched in a forced smile, but her chest tightened with dread. Marcus hadn't raised his voice, hadn't retaliated with rage. Instead, he walked away, calm as the eye of a storm, and that was far more terrifying. Her father, Richard Lancaster, leaned in, whispering harshly. "What did he say to you?" Victoria's fingers trembled around her champagne glass. "Nothing," she muttered. But the truth was gnawing at her. He had whispered just 6 words. "Check the balance of your kingdom." She laughed nervously, trying to convince herself it was an empty threat. But Richard's face paled. He knew Marcus Kane was no ordinary CEO. He had ties to global markets, digital banking networks, even private equity, firms their family relied on. A single whisper from him could rattle stocks, shake investors, and destabilize the empire the Lancasters had spent generations building. Meanwhile, across the room, Marcus stood in the corner, phone in hand. His assistant arrived within seconds, sliding him a slim folder. Marcus flipped it open, revealing documents thick with signatures and clauses. His eyes flickered toward Victoria, then to her father, and finally to the investors surrounding them. He tapped the folder once, as if sealing their fate. Then he gave a simple order. Initiate. Phones buzzed across the ballroom. Investors reached for their devices, their faces draining of color. One by one, murmurs spread. The deal they came to celebrate was no longer secure. A $4 billion merger was under review. Contracts once signed in good faith now bore red flags. Whispers sharpened. Why? What happened? Did Marcus just pull out? Victoria watched panic ripple through the crowd. She turned to her friends, expecting support, but even they pulled away, their smiles fading as they typed furiously on their screens. Suddenly, the heiress who had commanded the room just minutes ago looked like an island, cut off, alone, drowning under the weight of her mistake. And Marcus? He hadn't moved. He let the silence crush her. Every second felt like a hammer striking her reputation. Then he finally spoke, loud enough for the nearest guests to hear. A single act reveals 1,000 truths. The crowd grew still. What did he mean? Victoria's father clenched his fists. Marcus, he barked, striding toward him. This is outrageous. My daughter made a childish mistake. Are you really going to jeopardize billions over cake? Marcus turned his gaze on Richard. It wasn't anger in his eyes. It was disappointment, maybe even pity. This was never about cake, he said softly, yet the weight of his voice silenced the room. This was about respect. Something money can't buy, and your daughter can't fake. Gasps echoed. Victoria's mouth dropped. For once, she couldn't find a retort. But Marcus wasn't done. He reached into his folder and pulled out a photograph. It was old, slightly creased, but the faces in it were unmistakable. Richard Lancaster shaking hands with Marcus's late father. Back then, Richard had been a young banker, and Marcus's father a humble factory worker, fighting for fair wages. That handshake had promised equity, respect, and dignity. But it was a promise Richard had broken when he crushed the factory with predatory loans, leaving Marcus's family destitute. And now, decades later, the son of that factory worker stood before him. Not broken, but powerful. This isn't just business, Richard, Marcus said, his voice carrying like thunder. This is history coming back to your doorstep. The room erupted in whispers again. Investors leaned closer, hungry for the scandal. A Lancaster exposed in public? The humiliation was no longer Marcus's. It was theirs. Victoria staggered backward, her hands cold, her lips trembling. She wanted to scream at him, to laugh it off again, but her throat betrayed her. She saw her allies slipping away, one by one, and in their eyes, she saw something she had never seen before, doubt. And then came the dagger. Marcus raised his glass, not in celebration, but in challenge. To those who think money makes them untouchable, I say this. Humility will always be more powerful than humiliation. Glasses lifted hesitantly around the room, as if compelled by his authority. Victoria's glass shook so hard she nearly dropped it. And here's where you, watching right now, need to pause. If you were standing in Marcus's shoes, finally able to confront the family that once crushed yours, finally able to turn humiliation into justice, would you take revenge in front of everyone, or would you forgive and walk away? Comment below, because Marcus's choice in the next moment didn't just change his life. It changed the course of an entire dynasty. Because in less than 5 minutes, Marcus Kane would make a move that no one, not even the Lancasters, saw coming. And the fallout would be darker than anything this ballroom had ever witnessed. What would you do? Forgive the humiliation or destroy the empire? Drop your answer in the comments, because Marcus's next step shocked even his own allies. The ballroom air was different now. What had begun as laughter, champagne, and the smug confidence of the Lancaster family had shifted into a suffocating silence. The walls themselves seemed to lean in, the chandeliers no longer dazzling but casting cold, judgmental light. Every guest could feel it, the shift in power. Marcus Blackwell, once dismissed as a nobody, now commanded the room without raising his voice. Victoria Lancaster, her designer gown stained with the remains of the cake she had shoved in his face only hours ago, tried desperately to smile. Her smirk wavered, cracking at the edges like porcelain about to shatter. She looked at her mother, her father, her inner circle of friends, but no one returned her gaze with the loyalty she expected. They weren't laughing anymore. Marcus adjusted his cufflinks, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't need to shout. Every flick of his wrist, every measured step across the marble floor, was a declaration. He owned this moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but carrying across the hall like thunder in the distance. "What you just witnessed wasn't humiliation. Not for me. No, tonight revealed the truth. The arrogance of those who believe money gives them the right to treat others as less than human." Gasps rippled through the audience. Several guests shifted uncomfortably. They knew he was right. Some had chuckled at the cake incident earlier. Now they felt the shame of being part of it. Victoria slammed her champagne flute onto the nearest table, shattering the crystal. "You don't belong here," she hissed, her voice shrill. "You're nothing but a janitor's son playing dress-up. My family built this empire. We decide who belongs." Marcus turned slowly toward her, his gaze steady. "Your family built an empire on broken backs and silenced voices. But tonight, Victoria, your reign ends." The crowd froze. The words hung in the air, heavier than the chandeliers above them. He raised his hand, and from the side doors, a series of people walked in. Not lawyers, not bodyguards, ordinary people. Men and women in worn suits and simple dresses. Some carried folders, others photographs. One woman held a tattered work uniform from years ago. The guests whispered, leaning in closer. Victoria's face paled. She recognized some of them. Former employees. People her family had ruined. "Who are these people?" barked Henry Lancaster, her father, his booming voice desperate to regain control. Marcus didn't flinch. "These are the lives your empire destroyed. Tonight, their stories will be heard." A murmur of anticipation swept through the guests. The tension was electric, unbearable. The first woman stepped forward, her hands trembling as she clutched her faded uniform. "I worked in your factories for 20 years, she said, her voice cracking. "Then one day, without warning, we were thrown out. No severance. No explanation. Just replaced." Gasps again. Guests looked at each other. Some shook their heads in disgust. Victoria's eyes darted to her parents, silently begging them to intervene. But Henry's face had gone pale. Eleanor Lancaster, usually composed, was gripping her necklace, so tightly it looked like it might snap. Another man stepped forward, holding up faded documents. "My father died because safety measures were ignored. We begged your company for justice. We were met with silence." Marcus didn't interrupt. He let every voice, every wound, fill the hall. He knew the truth was more powerful than any speech he could give. The Lancaster guests shifted further. Some slipped out quietly, ashamed to be associated with the family. The empire's grip was crumbling right before Victoria's eyes. She tried to laugh, though it sounded hollow. "This is ridiculous. These are just bitter nobodies, desperate for attention. Nobody here believes them." But she was wrong. Everyone did. Marcus stepped closer to her, his voice low, intimate, but every word laced with steel. "You thought shoving a cake in my face would humiliate me. But tonight, Victoria, you and your family will drown in the truth you tried to bury." The audience leaned in further. Nobody dared to breathe too loudly. The ballroom, once filled with glitter and glamour, now felt like a courtroom, and Marcus was both the judge and executioner. Victoria's lip quivered, but she raised her chin, desperate to hold on to the last fragments of her power. "You think you can destroy me?" she spat. "I'll bury you. I'll bury every single one of them." But her voice cracked, betraying her fear. Marcus didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. "You don't have to believe me, Victoria. But you'll believe the one person you never expected." At that moment, the side doors opened again. The crowd gasped louder this time, a collective sound that echoed like a drumbeat. Into the room walked a woman older, her face weathered, but her eyes burning with quiet strength. She was dressed simply, but the weight of her presence was undeniable. Victoria's knees nearly buckled. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It can't be." The guests turned to Marcus, desperate to know who this woman was. He smiled faintly, not with joy, but with justice. "This is the one person who knows the truth about the Lancasters better than anyone." The woman stepped forward, her gaze fixed on Victoria. And as she opened her mouth to speak, the entire ballroom leaned forward, hungry for the revelation. But Marcus held up a hand, freezing the moment. The room was suspended in time, the tension unbearable. "Before she speaks," he said, his voice low, commanding, "remember this. Arrogance always believes it holds the power, until the truth walks in." The crowd erupted in murmurs, anticipation at its breaking point. Victoria's face was pale, her confidence gone. The woman took a deep breath. The next words out of her mouth would detonate like a bomb. And that was where the night shifted forever. The mysterious woman opens her mouth to reveal the Lancaster family's darkest secret, one that could obliterate their empire in seconds. But Marcus cuts her off, holding the revelation back until the perfect moment. You think the worst is over? You're wrong. Because what this woman is about to say will not only end the Lancasters' empire, it will rewrite everything you thought you knew about this story. Stay with me, because the next revelation will leave you speechless. And if you're not already, make sure you're subscribed, because you don't want to miss the truth when it finally explodes. The woman's steps echoed across the marble as she moved toward the center of the ballroom. Every heel strike against the floor sounded like a gavel coming down in judgment. The guests leaned forward in their chairs, some holding their breath, others clutching their wine glasses as if they were anchors keeping them steady in the storm. Victoria's face had drained of all color. Her eyes darted to her mother, then her father, pleading silently for them to intervene. But both Eleanor and Henry Lancaster were frozen in their seats. For the first time in their empire's long reign, they had no control. The woman stopped, turned slowly, and faced the audience. Her voice, though quiet, carried through the ballroom with razor-sharp clarity. My name, she began, her tone steady, is Margaret. And for 30 years, I served as the head maid in the Lancaster household. A collective gasp. Guests turned to one another, shocked. The Lancasters had always kept their staff invisible, shadows in the background. But here was one, center stage, no longer silent. Margaret's eyes shifted to Victoria, and her lips curled into a bitter smile. I raised you, Victoria. I wiped your tears when you fell as a child. I stood in the shadows at every birthday party. I was the invisible hand that kept this house running. And how did you repay me? Victoria's mouth opened, but no sound came out. You repaid me with cruelty, Margaret continued, her voice sharp now. You mocked me. You mocked my children. You treated us as dirt beneath your heels. And your family. She swung her gaze toward Henry and Eleanor. They encouraged it. Because arrogance is inherited in this family, passed down like silver spoons and diamond necklaces. The guests murmured, their disgust rising. A few even began to clap quietly, unable to hold back their support. Henry slammed a fist against the table, his voice shaking with rage. This is nothing but lies. We gave you everything. A roof, food, wages. Margaret cut him off, her eyes blazing. Wages? You call that exploitation wages? Do you want to tell them how many times you delayed paying us while throwing parties like this? Do you want me to show them the ledgers? She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick file, slamming it onto the nearest table. Papers spilled across the tablecloth. Payroll sheets, contracts, receipts. The truth in black and white. The ballroom gasped again, louder this time. There was no denying it. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for her necklace, tugging at it so hard it nearly snapped. Margaret, stop this madness. You're embarrassing yourself. Margaret leaned forward, her voice a low growl. No, Eleanor. I'm exposing you. All of you. And then she looked at Marcus. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, the audience realized they weren't strangers. Tell them, Marcus said softly. Margaret nodded. Her voice trembled, but she didn't falter. Years ago, before your empire reached its peak, you stole. You took contracts, silenced workers, crushed small businesses. And one of the men you destroyed was Marcus's father. The crowd erupted in a wave of shock. Victoria stumbled back, shaking her head violently. No, that's impossible. He's lying. They're all lying. But Marcus's calm voice cut through her panic like a blade. I'm not lying, Victoria. Your father destroyed mine. He took everything, our home, our livelihood. My father died with nothing because of the Lancasters. But do you know what he left me? He stepped closer, his eyes locked on hers. He left me a promise. That one day, the truth would rise. Tonight, that promise is fulfilled. The silence was deafening. You could hear the chandeliers hum with the electricity in the air. Victoria's chest rose and fell rapidly. Her arrogance was gone, stripped bare. For the first time, the heiress looked like a frightened child. No, she whispered. You can't do this. You can't take everything from us. Marcus leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper, but every guest heard it. Victoria, I'm not taking anything. You lost it yourself. The moment you believed cruelty was power, you signed your family's downfall. The words landed like a hammer blow. And then the final twist. Margaret's hand tightened on the papers. There's one more truth you need to know, she said, her eyes narrowing. The Lancasters' empire isn't just corrupt. It's bankrupt. Gasps turned into cries. The audience erupted in chaos. Guests leapt from their chairs, reporters scribbled furiously, investors whispered frantically into phones. The Lancaster empire wasn't just tarnished, it was finished. Henry staggered back into his chair, his face ashen. Eleanor covered her mouth, a strangled sob escaping her lips. Victoria collapsed. Her knees hit the marble, her trembling hands clutching at her gown as if fabric could hold her world together. Marcus didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply stood tall, watching the empire that had mocked him, humiliated him, and destroyed his father crumble in front of everyone. Justice wasn't loud. Justice was quiet, final. And then, with the entire ballroom in chaos, Marcus turned to leave. His footsteps echoed, each one a death toll for the Lancaster dynasty. The crowd parted for him, not out of fear, but out of respect. At the door, Marcus paused, glancing over his shoulder one last time. His voice was calm, but every word cut through the room like a blade. This is what arrogance costs. Remember it well. He walked out. Behind him, the once invincible Lancasters sat broken, their empire reduced to dust. The crowd knew it, the city would soon know it, and by tomorrow, the world would know it. And all because one woman dared to speak, and one man refused to forget. The ballroom had witnessed the fall of giants. The storm was over, but its echoes would last forever. People laughed when Marcus was humiliated. They thought the Lancasters would always win. But arrogance always falls. Do you think the justice he delivered tonight was enough? Or do you think the punishment should have gone even further? Comment below with your thoughts. And if you want more stories where truth cuts deeper than power, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to see what real justice looks like.